Hey everybody, welcome back to Pro Photo Tips. My name is Josh Cripps, and you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Joshua Cripps Photography. Now this is part 3 of the video series of how I created this photo in Gillespie's Beach in New Zealand, where the sandflies are voracious, but the sunsets are beautiful. And in this part of the video, I'm going to walk you through my exact post-processing workflow to get from this raw file to this final image. And going along with the theme of this entire series, you're going to see how simple the processing is. I'm not going to do any fancy exposure blending or crazy focus stacking or anything like that in Photoshop. In fact, we're going to do 100% of all the processing right here in Lightroom. So let me go back to the original. And let's take a look first at what exactly we want to do. So obviously we need to bring out a lot of the detail out of the shadows. So we're going to brighten up the exposure considerably at the same time without blowing out that cool sun star there. It's going to be easier to see in a little bit, but there's a very beautiful color contrast between the warm tones in the clouds that are being lit by the sun and the cool tones that are in the shadows. So we're going to try to bring that out as well. And we're going to brighten up that foreground and do a couple of other finishing touches, and you'll see just how easy it is. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Now, I always start all my edits by just double checking a couple of things. One, I want to make sure that I'm in camera flat, which is the most flat and neutral profile that my camera can create. It gives you the most basic starting point to put your edits into the photo instead of using something like a camera vivid, which adds all this saturation and contrast to start. I don't want that. I want to add it to my own tastes. I also want to make sure that if I go up here to lens corrections, that remove chromatic aberration is checked. And I want to make sure that there's no sharpening put in by default. I might go and put some sharpening in myself later, but for now I want that to be zeroed out. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get started here. And the first thing I want to do is just crank the exposure up and see exactly what kind of detail I can pull out of this thing. So I'm going to go really kind of an extreme amount here, like 3.5 or so stops up. You can see, man, that just brought out a ton of detail. It's amazing what these sensors are capable of these days. So cool. Step 1 done. Now, you can see that things are starting to look a little washed out, so I'm going to quickly jump back down to my effects tab and add a little bit of dehazing. And that's just going to help start bringing some contrast throughout the image. And I don't want to do this a lot. I generally almost never go past about 20. And the reason for that is it can really add to the cool temperature tones in your photo, as well as create some weird haloing artifacts. So about 20 is a really good place to start. Now let's jump back up to our basic panel. Obviously, increasing the exposure helped blow the sun out, but we can correct that by pulling our highlights back down, and I'll do it just to the point where the sun comes back in, like that. Beautiful. Now, I also want to bring out some of the shadows in these deeper areas here, so I'm just going to boost those shadows a little bit. Don't want to go crazy, don't want it to look like HDR, but I do want it to come out a little bit. Great. The next step, this is something I do to most of my images, is add some presence. This basically gives your photos a little punch and a little pop. Clarity is like local contrast. So that's going to help you add contrast not only to your darker areas, but your lighter areas and bring out all the details. And again, I never go usually past about plus 20, plus 25 is about the maximum that I'll do. Now, again, I want to bring out all of the nice color for this image, so I am going to increase the vibrance here, and that's going to help me bring out more of the cool tones, and I'm going to bring out the saturation as well. That's going to help me bring out some of the warmer tones. Now, you can see these yellows are getting super crazy oversaturated. That's okay. We're going to deal with that in just a little bit. Now, as I'm looking at the image here, to my taste, I'd say the ground is still a little bit dark. And in fact, if I look at the histogram, it kind of reflects that as well. So this big spike here is more than likely all of the tones here in the ground. And this secondary spike is what's going on in the sky, obviously with a tail of increasing brightness as you get towards the sun. So I'm going to try to up the brightness there a little bit. The way I'm going to do that is with a grad filter. So if you hit M, as in, man, I love using grad filters, or you can come up here and click on the grad filter button in the toolbar. Now what I'm going to do is I am just going to zero those out by holding Alt or Option and clicking on that reset that pops up. Now I'm going to increase my exposure a little bit. And again, I don't want to do this to an insane amount, this is a subtle thing, and obviously you can kind of salt it to your own taste. So I'm going to increase the exposure and just sort of apply it in a big, broad swath like that, so it blends very gradually across the frame. And I also want to increase the contrast of that area a little bit, just to add a little more punch. Okay, now we're starting to look a little bit better, but there's so much more that we can do to this image with some simple adjustments. So really quickly, let's jump down to the tone curve. This is where most of our contrast adjustment is going to take place. And now that I have increased the brightness of the foreground, you can see how that histogram is more consolidated into one big spike. And that makes it really, really easy to add a tonal adjustment that's going to affect the overall image in a really nice way instead of just the individual parts of it. So let's go with something like that. The reason I like using the tone curve to add contrast instead of the contrast slider is I can specify the exact tonal regions that I want to affect. I can just do the darkest parts or just the brightest parts or the midtones or whatever floats my boat. So something like that, starting to bring in a lot of really, really nice contrast and juice throughout the image. Beautiful. Okay, now this has affected the color a little bit. It's added a little bit more saturation, and it's made the colors a little bit more clear to see. And like I said at the very beginning, I want to kind of emphasize the color contrasts between the warm tones and the blue tones. And so I want those warmer tones maybe to look a little bit more red. And so the way I'm going to accomplish that is by increasing my white balance a little bit. Because you can see overall there's quite a lot of blue throughout the frame. Especially if you look up here in the thumbnail version, it looks quite blue. So let's go ahead and increase the warmth there. Not a whole lot, maybe something around the 6900 region. Cool. And to get those warm tones a little more red, I'm also going to increase the tint here from -7, which is on the greener side, to like say about a +4. So it's going to be a small change, but come on, just go a little bit. There we go. It's going to get rid of some of that yellowy, greenish tint throughout the image. All right, so now we have a really nice color balance, in my opinion, between reds and blues. And we can continue to emphasize this a little bit more, as well as deal with those overly saturated yellows around the sun here. In fact, that's getting a little hot. Let's pull some of those highlights back down. There we go. Cool. So we can do that color work here in the HSL panel. What this lets us do is target individual hue or individual color ranges and change their hue, their saturation, and their luminance. And in this case, we're going to deal with hue. We're going to take some of these reds, or excuse me, some of these oranges, and by clicking and dragging on them, I can shift them around. I can either make them more yellow or I can make them more red. In this case, I'm going to make them just a little bit more red to emphasize that blue-red color contrast. Something like that. Cool. Now let's jump over to our saturation, and I want to increase the saturation of those oranges and reds. Something like that. Especially the, I didn't make that enough of a change. So let's make those a little bit more red, because I really want to isolate those reds. I don't want those oranges to get that saturated, but I do want the reds to be a little bit more saturated. So let's go with something like, this is always the subtlest part of editing, is getting that good color balance where things are not too overcooked, but they're still beautiful and colorful. Maybe something right there. And if we want to emphasize more of that blue, we can also click and drag up on these clouds, and that's going to help us increase the saturation of our aquas and our blues. So let's take a look at what effect that did. You can see, oh yeah, I got rid of that ugly yellow-orange color cast and really made this nice kind of magenta blue contrast between the warm tones and the cool tones that I think is really attractive. Beautiful. Okay, now just a couple more steps to the processing, and we'll be all done. First thing is let's take a look at this stump here in 100% view and see what it's looking like in terms of its detail, because there's all these cool craggy bits going on, and if we can bring out some of those details and sharpen them, I think it's going to serve us well. So how am I going to do that? Well, basically I'm just going to drag up on my sharpening and see what kind of effect it has. Now I can adjust my radius to see if Making a larger radius, that's going to bring out more of the macro scale details, and a smaller radius is going to bring out more of the micro scale details. So something like that. I generally like to bring out micro scale details so things don't look overly chunky. Now, because I had to brighten the shot almost 3.5 stops here, you can see there's a fair bit of noise within the image. Part of that is due to the noise of brightening it, and part of it is due to this sharpening. So first things first, we're going to zoom back out and apply masking to our sharpening. And if you hold the Alt or Option key on your keyboard while you slide this up, it'll tell you exactly what is being sharpened and what's not being sharpened. So wherever it's white is being sharpened, wherever it's black is not being sharpened. I only want that sharpening kind of on the stump and the rocks. I don't want it in the sky very much. So I'm going to drag that masking way up. That's going to help with that a fair amount. Let's zoom back in. Yeah, that looks better already. And we can do further noise reduction by increasing this luminance smoothing. And that's just going to kind of smooth out all that gritty chunkiness that we saw on those rocks. And you want to be careful about taking that too high because it'll start to wipe out some of the finer detail in the photo. So that looks pretty good overall. Things are looking fairly detailed. Let's do some adjusting and see if we can bring out a little bit more detail. Okay, cool. There we go. Maybe just increase that radius a little bit. So now we got some nice detail going on there in that foreground. Okay, now you might have noticed already that the horizon bows up considerably. And that's a pretty common problem with these super wide-angle lenses is they have a lot of barrel distortion. As you get closer to the edge of the frame, things start to bow outward. And we can fix that really easily in our lens corrections. So if you pop that open and you go down here to Enable Profile Corrections, you can select a lot of times it'll try to identify which lens it is, or you can manually go in and tell it which one it is. So this is not a Nikon 14-24, it's a Rokinon 14, and so it'll apply the correction for that lens. Now, let's take a look. One of the ways I like to see if the horizon is straight is to bring up the crop tool by hitting R and then clicking just a little bit outside of it. And that brings up all these guidelines. You can see if the horizon is not only level, but flat. So I'm going to do a quick rotation to make sure that horizon is level. And you can see, yeah, it actually follows those grid lines really reasonably flat now. So that's a big correction for where it was bowing out so significantly before. So that looks a lot better. Now, you can see that one of the other adjustments that it does is with vignetting. And it's really brightened. It's removed the vignetting from that lens and really brightened the edge of the photo. Too much, in my opinion. So I'm going to pull that vignetting back down, something like that. Okay. Now, speaking of vignetting, I really like it as an artistic effect. When you darken the edges of your frame, it helps pull your viewer's eye towards the center of the frame. There's this very slight effect that keeps their eye bouncing back into the middle of the photo. But rather than do that via the lens correction, I really like doing it via this in the effects panel, the post-crop vignetting. Because that means if I crop or change the image, it'll apply the vignette to that crop and not to the overall image, which is what the lens correction tab does. So I'm basically going to grab this here and I'm going to slide it down until it kind of hits what I think looks good. And again, this is so personal preference, but maybe something kind of like that looks pretty good. You can see how darkening the edges of the frame really kind of pushes your eye from here to the brighter spots of the photo. And that's going to be pretty much everything we need to do to the image. You can see there is this lens flare thing right here. That's unfortunately not going to be easy to take care of here in Lightroom. The easiest way to do that would have been to take another photo in the field, sticking my hand into the frame and blocking the sunlight so you wouldn't get any lens flare at all, and then blending that photo in post. But again, this is all about simplicity. I want to show you guys how easy it is with just a couple of clicks to take a photo from something like the raw file on the left to the final image pictured here on the right. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this series. Again, it's all about simplicity. If you don't know what to do, keep it simple. Use the rule of thirds. Put your subjects on opposing third intersection points like this. Make really simple decisions for your settings. Go out at times when you know the light is going to be good, like at sunrise or sunset. You know, good photos, in my opinion, can be complicated, but a lot of times the best photos are the simplest ones. So I hope that's a lesson that you guys can take into your photography and on into the future. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please check out our newsletter for even more tips and gear reviews and inspiring photos, all kinds of cool stuff. And if you're interested in checking out some of the best in-depth photography and processing tutorials on the web, head on over to the Nature Photography Academy. Until next time, have fun and happy shooting.